What happens when one of the most controversial royals meets Hollywood's most provocative late-night host? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The tension was palpable from the moment the Duke of Sussex walked onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted the verbal warfare that was about to erupt. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses collide in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The atmosphere in the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was electric, as the cameras rolled for what producers thought would be another celebrity softball interview. Prince Harry, dressed in his signature casual blazer and jeans combination, strode onto the stage with his characteristic confident smile, waving to the enthusiastic studio audience. The crowd's cheers seemed genuine enough, but there was an underlying tension that even the most casual observer could detect. Kimmel, notorious for his sharp tongue and willingness to push boundaries, sat behind his desk with that familiar smirk that regular viewers know all too well, the one that usually signals trouble ahead. "Welcome back to the show, Your Royal Highness," Kimmel began, his voice dripping with what could generously be called sarcasm. "Or do I still call you that? I can never keep track of all these royal protocol changes." The studio audience laughed nervously, but Harry's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just Harry is fine, Jimmy. I think we've moved past all that formality, haven't we?" The response was measured, diplomatic, but those who know the prince well could detect the slight edge creeping into his voice. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Right. Just Harry, the guy who gave up his royal duties but still uses his royal title on Netflix specials. I have to ask, and I know this might be sensitive, but do you ever miss the days when people had to bow when they met you? That must have been quite the ego boost." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Harry's jaw visibly tightened. "That's actually a common misconception, Jimmy. The bowing was never about ego. It was about respect for an institution that served the British people for over 1,000 years. "Oh, the institution," Kimmel interrupted, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "The same institution you've spent the last few years absolutely demolishing in every interview, podcast, and documentary you can get your hands on? Come on, Harry, you can't have it both ways. Either the monarchy is this sacred institution worthy of respect, or it's the oppressive system you've been telling us it is." "Which is it?" The studio fell silent. Even the usually animated audience seemed to sense they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harry shifted in his seat, his media training warring with what was clearly growing frustration. "Jimmy, I think there's a difference between calling out harmful behaviors and completely dismissing an institution. What my wife and I experienced was unacceptable, but that doesn't mean—" "Your wife," Kimmel cut him off again, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Meghan, the former actress who somehow convinced a prince to abandon his family, his country, and his responsibilities. Tell me, how does it feel to be Hollywood's most expensive-kept man?" The words hit like a physical blow, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. Harry's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Excuse me." His voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes storms. "What did you just say?" The prince's entire demeanor had shifted from diplomatic charm to barely contained fury, and even Kimmel seemed momentarily taken aback by the intensity of the reaction he'd provoked. "Oh, come on, don't act like you haven't heard it before," Kimmel pressed on, apparently unable to recognize or simply ignoring the warning signs. "The whole world is thinking it. You went from being a respected member of the royal family to being— what exactly? A professional complainer? A Netflix content creator? Face it, Harry. Without that title you're clinging to, you're just another Hollywood husband living off his wife's career." The accusation hung in the air like poison, gas, and Harry's face had gone completely pale except for two bright spots of color high on his cheekbones. "You know what, Jimmy?" he said, his voice still quiet but now carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "I came here tonight thinking we could have a respectful conversation. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could discuss the important work we're doing with mental health advocacy, with the Invictus Games, with supporting veterans who've sacrificed everything for their countries. But clearly you're more interested in cheap shots and tabloid gossip." Kimmel sensed blood in the water and pressed his advantage. "Important work? Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've made a career out of throwing your family under the bus. Your father, your brother, your grandmother. Nobody's safe from Prince Harry's truth bombs, are they? And let's be honest, the only reason anyone cares about your important work is because of who your family is. The same family you can't stop trashing." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and something in Harry's expression shifted from anger to something much more dangerous. The prince who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who had faced Taliban insurgents and roadside bombs, was now facing a different kind of enemy. One armed with microphones and cameras instead of weapons, but no less intent on destruction. "You want to talk about family, Jimmy?" Harry's voice was now carrying a warning that even the densest observer couldn't miss. "Let's talk about loyalty. Let's talk about what it means to have someone's back when the whole world is trying to tear them down." His eyes were blazing now, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something that would make headlines around the world. But Kimmel, perhaps drunk on the adrenaline of the moment, or simply too committed to his attack to back down now, pushed forward into territory that would prove to be his biggest mistake of the night. "You know what I find really interesting, Harry?" Kimmel continued, his voice taking on that particularly nasty tone that his critics know all too well. "You talk about loyalty and having someone's back, but where was that loyalty when your grandfather was dying? When your grandmother was in her final years? You were too busy playing victim in Montecito mansions to show up for the people who actually raised you." The studio audience had gone completely silent now, the kind of uncomfortable silence that makes television producers break out in cold sweats. Harry's entire body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists on the arms of his chair. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying more menace than any shout could have managed. "Don't you dare bring my grandparents into this. You have no idea what you're talking about." The prince's accent had thickened noticeably, a sure sign to anyone familiar with the royal family that he was beyond furious. But Kimmel, riding high, on what he clearly thought was his moment of triumph, made the fatal error of doubling down. "Oh, I think I know exactly what I'm talking about. The whole world watched you abandon a 96-year-old woman who spent her entire life serving others, all because your feelings got hurt. And then you had the audacity to show up at her funeral like some kind of grieving grandson when everyone knew you'd been stabbing her in the back for years." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly cavernous studio space, and for a moment time appeared to stand still. Harry's face had gone from pale to ashen, then to a dangerous shade of red that suggested barely controlled rage. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others looked around nervously as if seeking escape routes. Even the camera operators seemed to sense they were capturing something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. "You," Harry said, rising slowly from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone fighting to maintain control, "are the most pathetic excuse for a human being I have ever had the misfortune to encounter." His voice was steady now, but there was something in it that made grown men take a step back. "You sit behind that desk every night, making jokes about people's pain, profiting from others' misery, and you think that makes you clever? You think that makes you important?" Kimmel, perhaps finally beginning to realize he had pushed too far, attempted to regain some semblance of control. "Hey, look, I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking. That's my job. If you can't handle a little criticism, maybe you shouldn't have signed up for the public life." But his voice lacked its earlier confidence, and there was a distinct tremor that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Criticism?" Harry's laugh was harsh and bitter, completely devoid of humor. "Is that what you call attacking a dead woman who spent 70 years of her life in service to others? Is that what you call mocking someone's grief? You want to criticize my choices? Fine. You want to question my decisions? Go ahead. But when you drag my grandmother's memory through the mud for cheap laughs and applause, you cross a line that no decent person should ever cross." The prince took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, and the host instinctively leaned back in his chair. "You know what's really pathetic, Jimmy? You built your entire career on other people's talent, other people's stories, other people's pain. You're a parasite feeding off genuine human emotion, and you're so desperate for relevance that you'll attack anyone, even the dead, if you think it'll get you a laugh or a headline." Kimmel's face had now turned an interesting shade of purple, whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear. "Now wait just a minute," he sputtered, his famous composure completely shattered. "You can't come onto my show and talk to me like that. This is my studio, my audience, my rules. You don't get to waltz in here with your holier-than-thou attitude and lecture me about decency." "Your rules?" Harry's voice rose for the first time that evening, and the sound reverberated through the studio like thunder. "Your rules include attacking grieving grandchildren? Your rules include mocking the dead? Your rules include humiliating guests who come here in good faith? Then your rules are as twisted and morally bankrupt as you are." The confrontation had now escalated beyond anything anyone in the studio had ever witnessed. Producers in the control room were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial, while security personnel had quietly positioned themselves closer to the stage. The audience sat frozen, watching what felt less like entertainment and more like a public execution. "You want to know what real loyalty looks like, Jimmy?" Harry continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his military training and royal bearing. "Real loyalty is protecting the people you love, even when it costs you everything. Real loyalty is standing up to bullies and cowards who think they can hide behind comedy and claim it gives them license to be cruel. My grandmother understood loyalty. She understood service. She understood sacrifice. Concepts that are clearly foreign to someone like you." Kimmel, now clearly desperate to regain some measure of control over the situation, made what would prove to be his final and most devastating error. "Oh, spare me the saint act, Harry. Your precious grandmother presided over an empire built on colonialism and oppression. Maybe if you spent less time worshiping her memory and more time acknowledging the harm your family has caused around the world, people might take your moral outrage seriously." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Harry's face went completely white, then flushed with a rage so pure and incandescent that several people in the front row actually leaned away from him. The prince's hands were shaking now, not with fear but with the effort of restraining himself from doing something that would end careers and possibly result in international incidents. "Get me out of here," Harry said, his voice deadly quiet but clearly audible to every person in the studio. "Get me away from this pathetic excuse for a human being before I do something we'll all regret." But even as he spoke these words, it was clear that the point of no return had already been crossed, and what was about to unfold would shock even those who thought they had seen everything in the world of celebrity confrontations. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and dissected by talk show analysts for months to come. Instead of simply walking away, Harry turned back to face Kimmel with the kind of controlled fury that only someone with military training and royal breeding could muster. The prince's voice, when he spoke again, carried the authority of centuries, of British monarchy, and the steel of a combat veteran who had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan. "You know what, Jimmy? I changed my mind. I'm not going anywhere until I say what needs to be said. The studio fell into the kind of absolute silence usually reserved for funeral services or execution chambers. You want to attack my family? My dead grandmother? The woman who devoted her entire life to serving others while you've spent yours mocking people for profit? Let's talk about that. Harry stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, and the host visibly shrank back in his chair. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you're some kind of comedic genius because you can make cruel jokes about people's pain. But let me tell you what you really are, Jimmy. You're a coward. A pathetic, sniveling coward who hides behind a desk and a microphone because you're too weak to face the world like an actual man. The prince's words cut through the studio air like a blade, and several audience members could be heard shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Kimmel, his face now a mottled combination of red and white, attempted to interrupt. Now listen here, you can't just— Shut up! Harry's voice exploded through the studio with such force that several people actually jumped in their seats. I'm talking now, and you're going to listen. For once in your miserable life, you're going to hear some truth instead of the sycophantic applause you're used to. The transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the diplomatic prince who had walked onto the stage barely 30 minutes earlier. In his place stood a man who had served his country in war zones, who had walked behind his mother's coffin at age 12 while the world watched, who had endured decades of media scrutiny and family tragedy. This was Prince Harry unleashed, and it was terrifying to witness. You want to know about loyalty, Jimmy? About service? About sacrifice? My grandmother gave up her entire life for duty. She could have lived in comfort and obscurity, but instead she chose to serve. Every single day for 70 years, she put others before herself. And you parasitic waste of oxygen, think you have the right to mock that dedication because it gets you a cheap laugh? Harry's hands were trembling now, not with fear but with barely restrained rage. My wife and I left because we were being destroyed by people exactly like you. People who profit from pain, who turn human suffering into entertainment, who think cruelty is a form of art. We left to protect our children from growing up in a world where their pain would be your punchline. Kimmel, clearly rattled beyond anything he had ever experienced, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. This is still my show, Harry. You can't just— Your show? Harry's laugh was harsh and bitter. Your show is a cesspit of cruelty, masquerading as comedy. Your show is where decency goes to die. Your show is everything that's wrong with modern media wrapped up in a pathetic package and delivered by a man with no soul and even less talent. The prince leaned forward, placing both hands on Kimmel's desk, bringing himself face to face with the host. Let me make something crystal clear to you, Jimmy. You will never, ever speak about my family again. You will never mention my grandmother's name again. You will never use my wife, my children, or my relatives as material for your sick little comedy routine. Because if you do, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every person in this industry knows exactly what kind of person you really are. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and Kimmel's Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he swallowed hard. You can't threaten me on my own show, he stammered, but his voice lacked any conviction. I'm not threatening you. Jimmy, Harry replied, his voice now deadly calm. I'm making you a promise. Cross that line again, and you'll discover that being a prince means having resources and connections that you can't even imagine. You'll find out what it's like when someone with real power decides you've gone too far. The studio audience sat, in stunned silence, many with their mouths literally hanging open. This was no longer entertainment. This was a public evisceration of one of late-night television's biggest names by someone who clearly possessed the tools and knowledge to back up every word he was saying. Harry straightened up, adjusting his blazer with movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? You could have been better. You could have used your platform to lift people up, to bring joy instead of pain, to celebrate human achievement instead of human failure. But you chose to be small, petty, and cruel. You chose to be a bottom feeder in an industry full of them. The Prince looked out at the audience, many of whom were now openly staring at Kimmel with expressions of disgust and disappointment. I'm sorry you all had to witness this tonight. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see what happens when someone finally stands up to a bully who's been hiding behind comedy for far too long. Harry turned back to Kimmel one final time, and his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. We're done here, Jimmy. Permanently. Don't ever contact me, my representatives, or anyone in my family again. And the next time you're sitting behind that desk thinking about making jokes at someone else's expense, remember this moment. Remember what it felt like when someone finally called you out for who you really are. With that, Prince Harry turned and walked toward the studio exit with the bearing of a man who had just won a war. The audience remained frozen in their seats, many clearly processing what they had just witnessed. Behind his desk, Jimmy Kimmel sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking, as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. As Harry reached the edge of the stage, he paused and looked back one final time. "Oh, and Jimmy?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "You might want to find a new line of work, because after tonight everyone's going to know exactly who you really are." The studio doors closed behind Prince Harry with a definitive thud that seemed to echo through the shocked silence. For several long moments nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. Jimmy Kimmel remained slumped behind his desk, staring at the spot where Harry had stood, his career and reputation lying in ruins around him like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The confrontation was over, but its reverberations would be felt throughout the entertainment industry for years to come. In 30 minutes, Prince Harry had accomplished what critics and competitors had failed to do in decades. He had completely and utterly destroyed Jimmy Kimmel's carefully constructed persona, revealing the cruel and cowardly man beneath the comedic facade. It was a masterclass in public humiliation, delivered with the precision of a military operation and the authority of royal blood. As the shell-shocked audience finally began to file out of the studio, one thing was abundantly clear: late-night television would never be quite the same again.